The new thing that people are very excited about is ibogaine or iboga. In 1 or 2 sessions, it has led to a significant number of veterans ceasing their alcohol use disorder, what is typically called alcoholism and opioid use disorder. Many, many people suffer, right? And what's required is money and scientists working on the right problems and ditching the things that aren't promising. But ultimately, there's no replacement for great ideas.
The narrative right now is that research funding is being cut like immensely. And I was wondering if you got a feel for how severe the cuts are. Is the narrative overblown?
There is an upcoming vote in Congress in September, I believe, and it's on the table to cut the overall budget for research for NIH by 40%, 40.
That's huge.
Which is huge.
That's huge.
The budget for research at NIH, there are multiple dimensions to NIH, and I don't want to get lost in the weeds of it. It's NIH is something I'm very familiar with. I was on grants panels for, over a decade. My lab was funded by NIH. We could go really deep into the weeds, but let's just keep it pretty simple. NIH funds basic research, which is research that it's not specifically geared toward understanding or trying to solve a particular cure or treatment for a disease. So think everything we understand about cell biology, not everything, but much of what we understand about cell biology was because of NIH-funded research into the functioning of the cell over the course of 50 or more years. And that led to important implications for treatments and cures for cancer. We don't have a quote-unquote cure for all cancers, but many cancers now can be cured.
And to be clear, these are non-commercial. This is like non-commercial research, so things that we cover a lot of.
Right?
Yeah, we cover a lot of.
Cannot be patented. So basic research is, a laboratory wants to understand how cells work, how neurons work, how the immune system functions, gut-brain axis, studies on, how stress impacts health, sleep, et cetera. Then the applied work is also funded by NIH. So clinical trials are funded by NIH. This is an enormous portion of the overall budget. The exact division between basic and clinical trial funding is hard to demarcate. But let's just, for sake of this conversation, just agree, because it's true that most of the basic research and clinical trials that are run in the United States are funded by the NIH. The NSF is a separate entity, right? But NIH, its specific goal is to improve the health and longevity of American citizens, and by extension, the rest of the world, right? Because it is fair to say that while there are excellent, research funding bodies in the UK and Germany and Switzerland and all over Asia and around the world, that the NIH, when people say it's the crown jewel, it's the one that's devoted the most billions of dollars to basic and applied research. And it's no coincidence that the majority of Nobel Prizes in physiology and medicine and chemistry and related fields have come from work that was either initially seeded by or certainly supported by the NIH. So you can't overstate the importance of NIH funding basic and applied research. Mm-hmm. That overall budget is facing a 40% cut in September. Now, I'm hearing two things out there, right? I wear many hats. One is my lab ran on NIH money. It no longer depends on NIH money. I'm a podcaster, so I have the ear of folks who are like, this is really scary, right? It gets very political because the current administration seems to be taking a more, they're going to revise the way that NIH is structured potentially, 20 plus institutes down to 8. So all of it looks at like downsizing. There are a lot of people who are terrified about this, okay? Mm-hmm. There's another camp that I hear from a lot, and I can't even say particularly on X, and I want to be very clear, this camp doesn't always lean right. It's pretty even across the board, that are saying, wait a second, why are we giving so much money to these universities to do research from our tax dollars? And I know this will upset people who are very science-minded, as I am, who care about science, but they're saying, why are we doing this, right? Some of these universities, not all, but some of them, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, UT Austin, et cetera, the private universities often, although some public ones too, have very large endowments. And they're thinking, why are we funding so much of this work? Maybe these tax dollars should go elsewhere. There are many, many people, who voiced to me that they don't want to give their tax dollars to basic or applied research at all. Okay, this is a large and growing crowd because they feel that there needs to be, for lack of a better way to put it, some truth and reconciliation, right? They want two things acknowledged. and I've actually heard this from many of the, let's just say the highly recognizable names in the world of Silicon Valley super tech or founders and funders and investors, et cetera. And those two things are the following. One, they want the NIH to acknowledge, or CDC and or others in government to acknowledge that there were, in their mind, failures during the pandemic, in particular, lockdowns that impacted the non-laptop class, okay? We're talking about janitors, staff, teachers, kids, et cetera. The other thing that they're very angry about is the lack of acknowledgement from the scientific community that the science community makes errors. They are frustrated by some recent unveiling of the fact that there were findings that later were found to be fraudulent, basically, and that it was never checked up on. So they're upset about the public messaging around health and science, right? They would have preferred, it sounds like, that people in government say, hey, listen, we have a virus that we don't understand, and we have ideas about what might control it, but we don't fully understand this. So it was very iterative, and a lot of people are pissed off, kind of like when you're 15 or 16 and you're being told you can't stay out late, and then your parents are staying up late, or or like we had governors who were saying you had to wear a mask, but then we're taped in fancy restaurants on the northern coast, and at restaurants, and like much in the way that a teenager goes, wait a second, like you smoke pot in college and you're telling me not to smoke pot, like there's a logical flaw here, and we at least need to talk about it. And then the last thing, and I know I'm going kind of fire hose here, but I want to make sure this comes out, is that the big issue that is really on the table as well is this notion of indirect costs. Mm-hmm. So you guys are finance guys. So basically, a laboratory might get a grant of $1 million across 4 years, so $250 a year for 4 years. And the university then gets what are called indirect costs. They get, let's say, $500K typically. It's anywhere from $300K on the million to up to $750K on the million. There are a few cases of even more than that. The so-called indirect funds that take care of administrative costs and the basic cost of doing research. And earlier this year, the Trump administration said, we're cutting that to 15% across the board for all universities. And that was very prominent on X because Elon retweeted it and a number of other people retweeted it. And I would say, while the indirects have been very controversial, I just personally, it's my view, okay, this is my personal view, is that a severe cut to the indirects, while on the face of it might sound good, that's going to disproportionately hurt the public schools without large endowments, okay, because they don't have money to dip into. And something more in the range of 30% seemed reasonable to me based on my understanding of what those funds are used for. But historically, there have been some challenges with indirects. There were universities, I won't mention which, caught for spending some indirects on things that were unrelated to the science, perhaps keeping the lights on in the English department. That's typically not the case now. It's for disposal of radioactive waste. It's for, janitors. It's for painting the walls of the building, but it's not for making, a lavish lifestyle for the administrators, right? If administrators have a lavish lifestyle, it's presumably through some other mechanism, not IDC.
Within the basic research that you're seeing, what should we be fighting for hardest to keep? What's on the frontier? What are you most excited about? And what should we be fighting for? Let's keep the funding there no matter what.
Despite the fact that NIH funds basic research and that many laboratories, including my own for many years, focused on basic research, like how does the visual system work? We always had an eye, every laboratory has an eye toward, what the translational implications could be.
Sure.
Okay. So we were actively involved in trying to solve blindness due to glaucoma, even though we were focusing on some basic questions. So I think it's a statistical issue. If you step back and you say, okay, in the field of, let's just say, vision, my former field, what is the leading cause of blindness? Cataract. But you know what? You can fix cataract. You can slide out the lens and you put in a new lens. That's being done now. Great. What's the second leading cause of blindness? More than 70 million people worldwide. Glaucoma. You can test for eye pressures, but once the cells in the eye start deteriorating, people go blind. There's no recovering those cells. So you could say, wow, so let's take the top, let's take the statistically the top causes of blindness, and let's fund those, okay? Retinitis pigmentosa, et cetera. You could do this for pretty much any field. So in the field of brain health, you'd say, okay, dementia, you'd say major depression, you'd say a stroke. I mean, it's not hard to know what the problems are to tackle. The problem is, deciding what the targets are.
Sure.
And as you mentioned, like with CRISPR, I mean, in many ways, it was a fortuitous thing, right? Dowd lab was working on bacteria. I mean, it's very hard to predict what basic research is going to lead into these different areas. But we know what the critical areas are. I, as a podcaster that covers science and health, will be the first to say that if you're not sleeping well, your mental health and physical health is not going to be good. You can miss a few nights sleep, but if you're chronically sleep deprived, you're sicker than you normally would be. If your gut health isn't proper, if you're not getting exercise, if you're not getting sunlight, if you're not doing these things, of course, right? But I think that people who are in the kind of hardcore mechanistic science community are like, great, we're all going to strive to do those things, and we should, but not at the exclusion of figuring out signaling pathways that are vital for like the GLP-1s are a beautiful example, right? This peptide acts at the level of the brain and the gut to make people feel more full. It also, by the way, shut down the debate as to why people are fat. It's because they eat too much. This peptide discovered in the discovery of this is worth spending 2 sentences on.
Please.
A Gila monster, a reptile that doesn't need to eat very often, makes a lot of this peptide that it turns out is manufactured by humans too. And if you increase it 1,000-fold in humans, you're not hungry anymore. And so I think that, the guy studying the Gila monster, I doubt was thinking about curing obesity, but there you go. Now, and of course, there's a debate to every one of these things. No medication should ever replace lifestyle factors, right?
Yeah.
There are many, I think we sometimes fail as healthy, fit people. We fail to understand that lifestyle factors are very hard for people to implement, even if they have copious amounts of disposable income and some free time. It's just tough. Yeah. It's just tough. It's hard to do. And so I think that the emphasis on nutrition and exercise is wonderful. I don't think anyone on either side of the political debate would argue that MAHA in principle, Make America Healthy Again, isn't a great thing. I think what they probably would appreciate hearing, now I'm speaking for kind of the more science, mechanistic, biology-minded folks, they'd probably like to hear a little bit more about, hey, there are probably signaling pathways in the brain that are relevant to, to depression that maybe a next class of antidepressant drugs would probably be good. So when you say what are the most important things, what we really need is a very rationally grounded planning committee to sit back and say, you know what, we're going to put X number of dollars towards this, X number of dollars towards that, X number of dollars towards this. Much of the work that's funded by NIH, here's the dirty secret, is already completed because they tend to fund things that are very certain to be completed. And so people put forward grants based on work and preliminary data showing I can do this and it's already kind of worked out, then they use the money for the next iteration. This is the dirty secret of every NIH-funded lab. And it tends to favor a kind of more pedestrian science. More money translates to, when it's excess money, I know that word excess money scares investors, especially if they're taxpayers. But if that money is being used to fund really bold hypotheses, like it's my opinion that every single peptide, not just GLP-1, every single peptide shouldn't be getting tested in the gray market of like gyms and like biohacking. Frankly, that's bullshit.
Yeah, and isn't the reason that we don't have good studies on a lot of peptides is it's not profitable to study them because they're effectively naturally occurring and you can't patent?
Like BPC 157, right? You hear about that all the time is, will it accelerate healing? The animal studies are solid. There's no human studies.
Would a drug company have to create some variation of it in order to patent it?
Most people have realized that GLP-1s are very expensive, and at the dosages that they're typically prescribed, people get some discomfort. And so the new thing is people get it compounded at a compounding pharmacy, and they're microdosing GLP-1s. The number of women that I know who are microdosing GLP-1 in service to the spring and summer, outrageous, right?
Yeah, and, outrageous.
It's outrageous. And the idea is that GLP-1 is a good example. I mean, again, insulin's a peptide, but there are many peptides. Like for instance, I'm very excited about this peptide pinealin for sleep, right? And it's for some other properties too. But there's no reason why a drug company would go patent pinealin. They're busy patenting drugs like the recent class of drugs, the DORAs. This is an interesting story. Work on a peptide called hypocretin. This peptide is involved in generating wakefulness. It's also in the feeding pathway. And there's a new class of sleep drugs that suppresses the wakefulness pathway as opposed to making you more sleepy, so lower abuse potential. The DORAs have been released, right? They maintain the architecture of sleep pretty well compared to other sleep drugs like Ambien, et cetera. Here's the issue. They're about $325 a month. So for a lot of people, that's prohibitively expensive. I don't want to cover too many things here, but I will say that Robert Kennedy has been pretty vocal about, at least before the election, about wanting things like peptides and stem cells and supplements to be more widely available. The truth is they're pretty widely available now. And I will put an asterisk on stem cells. I know a very prominent public-facing physician who was almost paralyzed permanently from a stem cell injection into the disc of his back. I talked to a neurosurgeon friend who ultimately saved his life, by the way. This is a well-known story within the wellness community. And he said, yeah, the discs can't accept stem cell injections. But if you go down to Mexico or you go out of country and you say, my back is hurting, they'll inject stem cells into the disc of your back. So is this to say that stem cells are bad? No, they're not ready for clinical use yet. And the United States has been very careful about things like this, because before they were careful, there was a clinic down in Florida that injected some stem cells into the eyes of people with macular degeneration who were worried about going blind. And guess what? They all went blind right away, permanently. So I do want any discussion about peptides and these kind of things. When you get into the realm of stem cells, it starts getting to be a serious matter. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm like, oh yeah, try this, do that, shoulder hurt, put some stem cells in. When you're talking about stem cells, you're talking about cells that can become essentially anything, including tumors.
Do you think that podcasters generally in health don't really understand broadly the responsibility they have?
Rob and I, we take it super seriously. I mean, I've taken heat for a bunch of things in the larger science community, but probably one of the things I've taken the most heat for is my belief that certain supplements can be helpful, not as a replacement for good behaviors and for prescription drugs. I'm a fan of certain prescription drugs. Listen, I'd read an episode on ADHD and talked about the prescription drugs and took a ton of heat from the kind of natural folks. And then I did one on behavioral tools for ADHD and took a lot of heat from the folks who said, hey, listen, my kid got a lot of benefit from taking stimulants for ADHD. So we do weave back and forth and on that kind of knife edge, and it can be tricky. In terms of microdosing, because I saw it come up in the comments before today's discussion, and so it's just kind of flagged in my mind. The data on microdosing psilocybin are basically clear that it's not known to have any major effect on major depression or some of the other things that psilocybin is being tested for clinically. Including major depression, PTSD, et cetera. The data from clinical trials out of Robin Carhart-Harris's lab at UCSF and elsewhere on high dose psilocybin, so macro dose, right? 2.5 grams. 4 grams is the quote unquote heroic dose if you're speaking Northern California language. Those dosages done in pretty maybe 2 weeks apart or so with the support of a clinical staff going into it, through it, out of it, et cetera, have been very successful in those trials for the treatment of depression. Microdosing has shown very little effect. MDMA was put up to the FDA last year as a potential treatment for PTSD. It has not been approved. It did not pass approval. Unfortunately, as a component of those trials, there were some sexual improprieties in one of the clinical conditions that all it takes is one bad incident, right? And then it was but it cued people to this larger theme. How are you going to protect patients who are really, they're not incapacitated, but they're not in a position to really advocate for themselves, that you need probably multiple clinicians in the room and checks and balances. So I think ultimately it will be approved. The remission rates on PTSD, by the way, from properly dosed and spaced MDMA is remarkable, up to somewhere between 60 and 70% remission rates on PTSD. And the new thing that people are very excited about is Ibogaine or Iboga, 22-hour psychedelic journey. This has been tested largely from Nolan Williams' lab at Stanford. It seems to, in 1 or 2 sessions, it has led to a significant number of veterans essentially ceasing their alcohol use disorder, what is typically called alcoholism and opioid use disorder. But you need to be heart rate monitored while you do this. The point here is that any discussion that we have on the podcast is, as you can tell, I'm not known for being very succinct. It's for a reason, right? You have to flesh out the conversation around these things. You can't just say psilocybin is good, MDMA, works, great, remission. People can really get hurt. There are a number of things that I hope that the NIH and the public health messaging going forward will be more expansive about, which are drugs that are currently prescribed at enormous rates in the United States and elsewhere for which there are very severe side effects. There's this whole thing about people taking finasteride and dutasteride, men, to keep their hair and getting permanent sexual dysfunction, right? Permanent sexual dysfunction. Some of them killing themselves as a consequence of this. I mean, these are young guys. It's clear those drugs have very different effects in young people versus old. Some people can use them safely, some people can't. These are FDA-approved drugs, as well as, I think we're finally coming around to the idea that the SSRIs can be very useful for things like OCD, in certain cases for depression, but it's a double-edged blade. A lot of people suffered it as a consequence. So I hope that, I hope very strongly for three things. One, as a scientist who essentially has my podcasting job because of the way the NIH supported me coming up through graduate school, postdoc, my lab, I think a 40% cut would be too severe. Regardless of the IDC issue, I think it's just too severe. It's going to kneecap science throughout the world and health, the growth of new discoveries throughout the world. I'd like to keep that funding level. I really would. What happens to IDC, what happens to Harvard and Columbia, separate matter within there. But then I would very much like a very thoughtful committee to go in and look at every single grant. I mean, listen, in the field of neuroscience, am I the most qualified to decide what grant should be funded or not funded? No, but I can tell you that I sat on study section for a long time, and I can tell you there were clusters of grants that didn't solve what good labs call the deletion test. If this laboratory didn't exist, would it change the direction of science? You have to pass the deletion test. It's not solve. You have to pass the deletion test. If you didn't exist, would it matter? That's a harsh test. Nobody wants to be subject to that test. But anyone that's getting millions and millions of taxpayer dollars, and by the way, millions of taxpayer dollars often to work on and kill, and we could argue about I think most people are speciesists. They'd rather see a mouse or a rat life or a non-human primate life. But we're killing animals. We're occupying the lives of graduate students and postdocs with taxpayer dollars. The work needs to be justified by passing the deletion test. And the idea that AI could, do that, maybe, but the idea that a jury of close peers are going to decide the deletion test, and if you pass, that's flawed in my opinion. Because the in culture, we don't have time for this, but the in culture of science is, people aren't helping each other out just to help each other out. But when you're very close to something, it's very hard to make a really clear decision about it. And when you're too far from it, you're not qualified to. So we need people that are in the middle who can really go in and say, okay, in the field of let's say visual repair and neuroscience, give me a scalpel. I hate to do it, but also, some are going to pass. And then I do think that instead of cutting people's funding entirely, there should be initiatives saying, hey, listen, if you want to run a laboratory, would you be interested in working on these important projects that maybe the Americans paying for this research ought to be able to upvote?
How do we really make science amazing and ensure really strong progression over the next few decades?
We can't forget that there are certain basic discoveries, going back to our earlier discussion, that have led to tremendous treatments, like the drops to lower eye pressure in glaucoma. If you catch your eye pressure elevation early and you take those drops, you will keep your vision.
Wow.
Okay. Right? You'll keep your vision. So it's not like we can't cure glaucoma, but you have to, that's based on basic work. So the real key here is to ask, so where has it been done successfully before? It's been done successfully in the world of computer science and AI, right? Growing up, I heard about AI. It was kind of like no one took AI seriously growing up. Peter Thiel had the breakthrough labs idea. He was paying people to not go pursue graduate degrees in labs to get the PI, like me, papers and advance their careers and then maybe go get their own lab, but to take great ideas and go through breakthrough labs. I don't know what happened to breakthrough labs, but I do think that incubators like that, where you have enough money to test, to move fast, right? Move fast, break things model, figure out whether or not something is promising and then advance that. And here's the key. As soon as something looks promising, you want to be able to pour human power onto that. And the problem in academia is every graduate student and postdoc needs a first author paper in order to have the potential to get a job. And so one thing that I've been in Jay Bhattacharya's ear about is, I think the independent investigator model of science in this country, where it's the Huberman lab or it's the whatever lab named after the PI, I think that's a flawed model. This is going to really upset some people. There should be labs named after a particular mission, like curing blindness laboratory or solving Alzheimer's laboratory. And then people can collaborate within that lab without the idea that they're necessarily going to go start their own lab. In Europe, typically there's a lab head, and it's very hierarchical, but people who get PhDs often stay in those labs as permanent careers. They get paid better and better. The NIH has not had a mode to keep paying people as staff scientists. And most people don't want to go off and run their own lab. So I think the ability to iterate more quickly, much like a tech company, funded by NIH would be enormously beneficial. And I could be wrong, but I think it's going to be music to most people who would like to go to graduate school. Because what it means is that you can be on the bench next to someone and they get the thing that's really interesting. And rather than feel like, shit, I got nothing, you can now start working together to accelerate the progress of that work. And so now who can go off and run a lab becomes a separate issue, but it really becomes discovery-based science. And we can't forget that the taxpayers are funding this, right? So this is like, as much as we'd all like it, the next generation of scientists to all have their own labs, I think what we really want is for the next generation of scientists to have the opportunity to make fundamental discoveries that seed health and cures and treatments for disease.
I do think it matters that young people aspire to be scientists.
Yes.
And that is a concern that I have about the destruction of trust between the public and the science community.
These kids that would potentially become scientists, we can harness their energy. They didn't lie. They didn't do anything wrong. And if we train them properly and we put them into an environment where the spirit of that environment is just discovery-based, maybe a little less careerist, a little more discovery-based, and we really fund the most important work, we can really transform the treatment and cures for all these diseases that everyone is so concerned about. I know that because it's proved to be the case every single time. If you look at AIDS, there are two things that led to the treatments, and AIDS isn't fully cured, but it's a very different landscape now than in the 80s. Two things, right? Money and emotion. And it came emotion first and money, and then a bunch of scientists in labs and a bunch of funding. Okay, so the reason we don't have a cure for schizophrenia, even though it's 1% of the world's population, is sadly it tends to run in families. There's not a strong lobby for research on schizophrenia. The director of NIMH told me that, former director, Bob Desimone. The reason there's so much interest in autism is that any human being with half a heart looks at a kid, and I'm not talking about kids that are on the spectrum or a little neurodivergent who, I work with those people. Like, we're not talking about that. I'm talking about kids that have like stereotyped motion, can't be in an open environment, will forever need support. I'm not trying to like split the spectrum, but there are kids on the spectrum that really struggle, right? And so the reason there's so much interest in finding treatments for things like that or for major depression is because many, many people suffer, right? And what's required is money and scientists working on the right problems and ditching the things that aren't promising. The faster you can iterate, the better. And so I do think the Silicon Valley model has something to offer. Now with AI, you can also run lots of hypotheses in silico, more in vitro, then move to in vivo models. I mean, there is a way to make the money go further, but ultimately there's no replacement for great ideas. And there's no replacement for human energy. And the best source of human energy that I know is youth. You want to harness that energy of youth and the spirit of discovery and give people the resources. I had wonderful mentors, and one of the most important things they taught me was you get money, you give it to young people, and you get the fuck out of their way and let them try. And then when they don't work, you guide them and you say, listen, like, you're wasting your time, move on. And eventually you get hits. And then if you can pile human power onto those hits, right? I'm just describing what everyone knows to be true, but this is not the way that the system has been designed. It is old and clunky, and it doesn't need to be scraped or, hacked in half almost at a 40% cut, but it does need to be revised. It really does.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Well, this was fantastic.
I want to say thanks to you guys. I started watching your show since you had Rob on.
Fantastic.
What you guys do is great. I also think that you're transforming the way that media is dispersed each week, and it's awesome. You guys are on X doing what you do and elsewhere. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much for hopping on.
Awesome. You're the man. Cheers.